Welcome to Diabetes Day by Day, the American Diabetes Association's official podcast. We know there are many, many ways that you get information about diabetes, and we're glad that you join us here to learn. Resources from the American Diabetes Association, such as this podcast, a lot of resources on their website, are great places to learn more about diabetes. And today, Sarah and I are going to be Mythbusters. We're going to talk about some common misunderstandings and some common things that we think that are correct. And we'll also talk about resources where you can go to get more accurate information, because accurate information these days can be hard to find. I'm Dr. Neil Skolnik, professor of family and community medicine at the Sidney Kimmel Medical College of Thomas Jefferson University. And joining me, as always, is my co-host.
I'm Dr. Sarah Wettergreen, an assistant professor at the University of Colorado Skaggs School of Pharmacy and an ambulatory care clinical pharmacist.
Sarah, I know we were talking earlier, we both have patients that come in and with the best of intentions, trying to do the best thing they can for themselves, sometimes have the wrong conclusions. And as I say that, I think about a patient who I saw who I had been taking care of for some time, and he had very high cholesterol, diabetes, very high cholesterol, also had blood pressure issues. So significant risk for developing coronary disease down the road. And we drew a lipid panel, a cholesterol panel that he had done a few days before his visit. And he came back and his LDL, his low density cholesterol, was 185. And for our listeners, you want to see it at least below 100, often lower. The new guidelines even lower, but at least below 100 for LDL if you have diabetes. And his always had been below 100, and suddenly it's 185. And I said, can I ask you, I see this difference. Anything new going on? He said, no. I said, you sure? I said, well, oh yeah, I stopped taking my atorvastatin, one of his statin medicines. And I was like, that explains it. Can I ask why you did that? Because you didn't mention that to me. And he said he had a couple of months before, he was watching TV and he saw a TV host explain that statins cause diabetes. And he did what I really do think many people do. We get information. We don't really want to bother or the pharmacist or the doctor, and we make a decision and we stop taking the medicine, which isn't always, by the way, the right way to approach this. And I thought that's a nice story to, enter our discussion, because there's both an issue about getting the right information, and we'll talk about statins later. Audience, stay tuned. We'll cover this issue. But the point is, there's both information, but there's also putting the information into perspective that is so important. Sarah?
I have heard similar stories to yours, Neil, and definitely had similar conversations. I think it's just really hard to know where to get accurate information sometimes, or you hear something and you're trusting that this person is giving you all the details you need to make an informed decision about it, but sometimes they're not. Some articles have inaccurate information, or sometimes there's supplements even that are making claims that they can cure diabetes, and we know that that's not the case. And how do we look at the data to dispute that and get an understanding of, well, where is someone getting the impression that that could even be right? I'll share, there was an article published recently in a medical journal that's well established called The Lancet that Neil and I both reference. And that article discussed some of the misinformation about diabetes that's shared through even social media. So today we're going to talk about some commonly heard statements, and we will tell you if we consider this statement a fact or if the statement is fiction and not completely accurate. How does that sound, Neil?
That sounds great. It sounds like fun and it sounds important. Let's go ahead and get started.
Okay, great. So, Neil, I'm going to start with a question for you first. The statement is eating too much sugar causes diabetes. Do you think that's fact or fiction?
Sarah, it's interesting. Let's take type 1 diabetes first. clearly fiction, right? We know that type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune process where the body creates antibodies to its own islet cells of the pancreas, and that leads to decreased insulin production, and therefore sugar goes up and you develop diabetes. It gets a little trickier now with regard to type 2 diabetes. So there, it's not entirely factual, but not totally fiction, right? So that we know sugar is an important contributor. When we eat a lot of processed foods of any type, and we eat a lot of processed carbs, particularly, of which sugar is probably the most highly processed carbohydrate, our sugar levels spike. We know that all those empty calories lead to obesity. Obesity leads to insulin resistance, and insulin resistance leads to diabetes. So while the sugar doesn't cause diabetes, there's many people who have lots of sugar who don't develop diabetes. There's no question that sugar contributes to diabetes. It's a more nuanced answer, Sarah, but I think an important one for our audience to understand. How your thoughts on that?
That's such an important distinction. And I think this one comes up with so many people in conversations. I asked you this question because I was recently at an event with some friends, and there were all kinds of sweet treats there. And one of my friends said, "Well, I don't want to eat any of those. I don't want to get diabetes. If I eat all of this, I'm going to end up with diabetes." And we just know that it's a little bit more of a complicated process than that. Having, a single cupcake in one day isn't going to be the difference of you developing type 2 diabetes or not. There are a lot more things to think about in that conversation.
It's such a good point, but I like the way you emphasized in one day. The habits we develop every day heavily influence the outcomes we have in life, and that's true in every respect, right? It's true with regard to exercise. It's true with regard to paying attention to the relationships that we cherish. We want to make sure every day we spend time with the people, talk to the people we care about, exercise regularly, eat well. Habits are important. Next question, Sarah. It's going to get tough. Let's stick with diet. The statement is there's one best diet for all people with diabetes. Fact or fiction?
This one is also fiction. And I'm actually really glad that this one is not true. I think it gives people a lot of freedom in your food choices. If there was only one specific thing that you could eat all the time, what a boring life that would be. So, when I think about food, I really try to think about each component in terms of its nutritional value. And sometimes we can think of that in that term called macronutrients. So there's no way to balance those macronutrients, which we think of as being protein or carbohydrates and fats. And there's nothing within those that can be a perfect fit. We hear lots of buzz around things like, oh, if I have diabetes, that means I can't have any carbs. And you start a low or no carb diet, or maybe even a moderate carb diet and a higher protein diet. We hear so many of these fads, but I think it's important to think about really what's best for you as an individual and what you feel good about eating, and really thinking about the nutritional value of those pieces. So, when thinking about the nutritional value, I think one thing it's important to keep in mind is how are those foods bringing you fuel and energy. One piece that is helpful is to also think about your total calories when you're thinking about your eating patterns. But generally, finding that balance between things like non starchy vegetables, fruits, whole grains, dairy products, and generally limiting added sugars where you can. That's a recommended way to eat. But even in that, you can think of so many different options within each of those categories. So there's so many ways that this can be done, but it definitely doesn't mean you can't ever have sweets. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. And, like so many things, in moderation. Um, it's going to be interesting, Sarah. Let our audience know that a future episode in August, we're going to do a deep dive into the whole idea of the importance of nutrient dense foods. So, this is an area that is of such critical importance. we'll spend a whole podcast, and over time, it wouldn't be surprising if we spend more than one podcast talking about nutrition. Now, I have another tough question for you, Sarah.
All the tough questions today.
Fact or fiction, for people with type 2 diabetes, metformin should be the first line medication.
This statement is an interesting one, Neil, because a few years ago, that probably would have been right. And I feel like we just can debunk any statement that says should in it. We know that that's probably not going to be accurate. So we know that data has also changed quite a bit in the last few years, and that statement's not true for everyone. Selection of medication therapy, especially in type 2 diabetes, has become much more personalized and maybe a little bit complicated at times because of that. If you're someone who's listened to our previous episodes, you might remember we've talked about higher risks of things like heart disease and kidney disease and people with diabetes. So, if someone has type 2 diabetes and also has one of these conditions, it's now recommended to first start with a medication therapy that can help with multiple things, such as lowering glucose, which is a goal of any of our therapies, but also improving those cardiovascular and renal outcomes, such as with medications like these SGLT2 inhibitors and GLP-1 receptor agonists that we've talked about before. Now, metformin is still a good option for a lot of people. I don't want to discredit it completely. We know that for many people with type 2 diabetes, they find benefit in using this medication in combination with other therapies if they need additional glucose lowering. And that's because it works really well at lowering glucose, but also has a lower risk of hypoglycemia or dropping the blood sugar too low, and it's generally more affordable than some of our other therapies and can be considered one of our more inexpensive options. Some people might not be able to tolerate metformin due to GI side effects or might not be a good candidate for using it based on their kidney function. So it's good news that there are still a lot of other medication options available. Lots of places that metformin is still used, but not necessarily first for everybody.
Sarah, it's so important. Our main theme for this podcast has always been patient empowerment. And this is one of those areas where you might get put on a medicine a while ago, and then the recommendations change, but no one really thinks to say, should we change things for you? And this is where, to our audience, if you're on a medicine, whatever it is, not a bad idea to ask the clinician who is caring for you, I've been on this for a few years. Is this still the best choice? Particularly here, as you said, Sarah, if you have chronic kidney disease, or you have coronary artery disease or heart failure, or you're at high risk for one of those, and you're only on metformin, there are all these new medicines that are available now that might be better choices. It's worth asking the clinician that takes care of you. And that leads to the thing that I said earlier about perspective. That's where it's almost impossible to figure it out all ourselves, that having someone you trust that can put the choices in perspective is immensely helpful. Sarah?
Exactly right. And in that mindset of empowerment, I think some people just learn to live with a side effect rather than pursuing different options. There's multiple people that I've worked with who, for years were taking metformin, had terrible stomach aches with it or cramping. We know that doesn't happen for everybody, but if it does, it can be pretty life altering. Like it might feel uncomfortable leaving the house because you're not sure when it might hit. So, with that in mind, I've seen people come off of that medication and have those symptoms completely resolve. So, we just have to remember that some medications might work great, but are not the best for that individual or that person. And it's great that we have other options.
Great
So,
point.
Neil, I want to take myself out of the hot seat for a minute after those two tough questions you gave me. So, we're going to turn back to you. Our next statement: diabetes education is recommended for all people with a new diagnosis of diabetes. Is that fact or fiction?
Sarah, nothing could serve as a better example of a fact. Sarah, it is so important that people with a new diagnosis of diabetes learn all they can about what they have. And because it's so important, the American Diabetes Association has set up a whole set of certifications of people who are certified in diabetes education and support specialists. There's a whole society that has the certification for that so that people know what it is that you as a person with diabetes needs to know in order to take the best care of your disease. And it isn't just like going into someone for 10 minutes where they tell you about it. This is multiple 45-minute to 1 hour sessions. They can be in groups, they can be with individuals, and they cover all aspects of self-care because there is nothing more important than self-care when it comes to managing diabetes. When someone, Sarah, sees you in consultation or myself, yeah, we go over things as best as we can, but that's how often, once every few months at the most, really. People themselves are living with managing diabetes 24 hours a day, every day. So, education is probably the single most important thing that we have to offer.
That question mostly focused on new diagnosis, which is certainly at a critical time to learn about that diagnosis and how the many multitude aspects of your life play into that. But if you're someone who's listening and you're like, well, I didn't get that, and I've had this, for so many years, it's never too late. And I think there's always something you can learn more in addition to what you already have learned from living with diabetes day to day, even if it's just getting the new updates of, what are the different medications available, or what are the other things I should be thinking about, the new technologies for managing glucose that we talked about last month. There's always something where you can learn.
That's true. Sarah, let's come back to cholesterol and one of the most common medicines prescribed, statins. A concern I often hear about is that cholesterol medications, statins, cause muscle pain in most people that take them. Is that fact or fiction?
Neil, I hate to tell you this. You picked one of my favorite subjects to ask me about. So this one is fiction. I think it's something that is a common fear or something that people have likely heard about if they've ever talked to somebody who's taken a cholesterol medication called a statin. While these side effects of muscle aches with them can happen, it's not necessarily common. I can see why this message happens though. If you look online and you look at statin medication side effects, which I checked today just to still see what's coming up, you'll find reports that muscle pain is one of the most common complaints by people taking them. Well, it is one of the most common complaints of the people who have side effects. But the good news is most people don't have side effects with these medications. And I think that's the message that gets lost in translation sometimes. About 95% of people who take statin medications don't have any muscle ache symptoms at all. So, overall, the side effect of muscle aches does occur, but not necessarily commonly. The other thing we've learned from clinical studies is that there's something called a nocebo effect that even might make this rate of 5% occurrence falsely high. The concept of nocebo effect is that someone experiences a side effect by being told that they could have a side effect from a medication. So, for example, they have studies that have done this where they give people sugar pills and tell them, you're taking a statin medication, and this medication can cause muscle side effects. Well, even though they were actually being given a sugar pill, we still saw a similar rate of people experiencing the muscle symptoms because that idea was implanted in their mind that this could cause this. So we know that aches can occur with this medication. It also can occur in day to day life. There are definitely times I've had too high of a workout and thought, if I was taking the statin, I would definitely be blaming it on that right now. So when we think about those symptoms, there are a couple ways that you can think about the symptoms you're experiencing to see, is this really from my statin medication, or the likelihood that it is, or is it maybe something else? Thinking of that, we want to think of the presence of the medication and in terms of when the muscle symptoms occurred. So typically in about the first month or so, you're most likely to get those symptoms. They'll also occur in the larger muscle groups in the body and typically on both sides of the body. So you'd be thinking both thighs, both upper arms is common places. If you're having symptoms in all of those places within a month of starting the cholesterol medication, definitely worth talking to your doctor about. If it's, cramping in your hand once in a while after you've been on your phone a lot, probably not from the medication. But still, you can bring that up if you want to be sure with your doctor.
Excellent. I'll follow up, Sarah, about briefly statins and the question my patient raised about diabetes. And it is something that is out there, and it's another one of those that are partial fact, partial fiction, that among large groups of people, the use of statins does somewhat increase the risk of diabetes over time. But the important thing, and it's back to having someone who can put this information in perspective for you, the benefit on lowering the risk of heart disease far, far exceeds any effect on blood sugar. So it's often not just information per se, but being able to put that information in perspective.
Well, I'm so glad we've now debunked two myths related to statins and got to dive a little bit deeper. So, now to our very last question of the day for you, Neil. Fact or fiction? People with diabetes can feel when their glucose is high.
That, Sarah, is fiction. I wish it were true. We could throw away our glucometers, our CGMs, all that, but it's not true. So we need to know how to use our technology. And a lot of people, feel that they can tell when their blood sugar levels are high, same as many people feel they can tell when their blood pressure is high. Now, that is true when it's very, very high for either one of those two parameters. When you're exceedingly high, you don't feel right. But in the levels that people often go in and out of every day, if blood sugar levels up in the high hundreds, low to mid, even high 200s, most people don't detect reliably a difference in the way they feel. The take home message here is make sure to rely on the laboratory measurements, your A1C, your self monitoring of blood glucose on your glucometer, your CGM, whatever method it is that you use. It is far more accurate than that sense of knowing what's going on without measuring. Sarah, we only have a few minutes left. Any final thoughts that you have?
Yes. I mean, first off, wow, we've debunked a lot of myths today. But I think another thing that we've done is highlight where there are some gray areas as well. Some of these are more of a clear fact versus clear fiction, and some of these are in the gray. And so that's why I think it's important to know where to get your information so you can continue to learn more. So, some resources that I'd recommend online that are reputable, of course, would be the American Diabetes Association website, which is www.diabetes.org. There are also helpful web pages from other reputable organizations, such as the Centers for Disease Control, that might be helpful. And these are just a few examples of places that would be good to start. I'd also say asking questions to your healthcare team, of course, is going to be a recommendation of mine as another place to go. Going directly to your primary care provider, your local community pharmacist that you can go chat with even without an appointment. Those are places where you can go get some reputable information or at least learn where you can go to learn a little bit more about some of these topics.
Excellent, Sarah. Thanks so much. It is always such a pleasure talking with you about all these subjects.
You too. This was a fun game. We might have to do it again sometime.
I think so. And to our audience, of course, thank you. Tune in next month for a discussion of a pretty amazing resource that the American Diabetes Association has run for years, ADA Camp, where, and I'm going to quote from their website, children living with diabetes can just be kids. It lets kids with diabetes know that they're not alone, that their diabetes doesn't have to hold them back in any manner. And the story of what these kids do, what the counselors do, what the camp does for kids is, Sarah and our audience, just an inspiring story. I'm looking forward to that episode. Also, to our audience, don't hesitate to leave us a message with your thoughts on our dedicated podcast phone line, which is 703 755 7288. If you'd like, leave us some suggestions about what you'd like us to answer on future fact or fiction podcasts. Feel free to comment on anything we've said in our episodes. We may read and discuss your question and comments on our podcast and even leave suggestions for future episodes. We're interested in your thoughts. That number again is 703 755 7288. For the American Diabetes Association, I'm Dr. Neil Skolnik, and thanks for listening.